Let's make history. So this is the story about how New York City got so dark during the 1970s. There were even movies made about this, such as the cult classic The Warriors, and then you have Fort Apache and others. Decisions that politicians make do have an effect on the people. And the best example to prove this is what happened to New York City in the 70s.
If you had a car, you'd put a sign in the window that said, "No radio in here," so that someone wouldn't come along and smash it up. And there were people begging everywhere.
It was terrible. The city wasn't safe, and we almost went bankrupt.
Most of the parks had not had any investment in them for years or decades. There was a lot of crime, there was a lot of graffiti, Bryant Park being one of the worst. It had 500 felonies in 1979, which is a lot of felonies.
The airport was like a third world country. The highways were filthy, abandoned cars, tires, grass overgrown everywhere in the center islands, graffiti everywhere. It was just bedlam. Every day, everybody was victimized by the fear-inducing quality of life decay and disorder in the city. In 1990, worst crime year in the history of New York City, 500,000 serious crimes reported: murders, rapes, robberies, burglaries, car thefts.
You never want someone to come up to you to rob you and you have nothing to offer, because that might anger the individual and you might be one of those 2,500 people that lost their life that year. And I'm saying to myself, like, wow, how did we get here?
And if you'd like to see that documentary in its entirety, I will leave a link in the description. If you're watching this on Instagram or TikTok or anywhere else, you'll have to come over to YouTube. So John Lindsay was elected mayor of New York City in 1966. The people were still devastated from the assassination of Malcolm X the year before, and Puerto Ricans and New Yorkers were also still mourning the death of Don Pedro Albizu Campos, which also took place the year before. So John Lindsay was a Republican soon to turn Democrat, and he made a few major blunders in the process. The first thing he did was drastically expand welfare. And he was encouraging people to sign up for welfare, promoting the idea of welfare. He was piggybacking off of President LBJ's Great Society legislation, where they felt as if they subsidized the income of the lower classes, that would bring them up a few notches, and then everybody would be happy. But that was a huge mistake. The opposite actually happened.
And the city was known for having pretty generous welfare benefits.
John Lindsay basically encouraged the city to get more and more people onto welfare at that time. He spent money on expanding a whole set of welfare agencies whose job was to reduce poverty, but simply created poor people as clients who then became a permanent underclass. So the roles just expanded incredibly. But it also affected the other parts of the city and the quality of life.
The second major mistake he made is he took a soft-on-crime approach. This was a precursor to the defund the police movement of the 2020s, of the year 2020, during the George Floyd riots and protests. And this was back in the early 70s. So he took a soft-on-crime approach. Of course, murders, armed robberies, certain things you had to get involved, but he encouraged the police, directed them to look the other way when it came to crime, to make up for the fact that the people who were committing the crimes were, in his words, victims of racism and corruption. But as we can see how these communities turned out, they actually made the problem worse. crime got so out of control that businesses began to leave the city. People began to leave the city. New York lost about 1 million residents by the time Lindsay left office in '73, plus over a half a million jobs left the city. You had landlords setting their buildings on fire, creating a scene out of a post-apocalyptic film. I mean, the Bronx was looking like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome during this time in the '70s. And that continued. That situation actually snowballed into a major crime wave that would last over a period of 3 decades.
In the early 1970s.
When he took office in 1966, there were roughly 600 murders. And when he left, 8 years later, there were approximately 1,700 murders a year.
When Police Commissioner Patrick Murphy took over the NYPD in the early 1970s, his focus was reducing systemic corruption within the department. But what he did also, he had us in uniform stop making narcotic arrests. The one thing that was true then and today, there's a nexus between illegal narcotic activity and violent crime in New York City.
He was sort of a proto-perpetrator of the phony narrative that colorblind institutions dedicated to law and order are racist. He believed that excusing crime was doing people a favor. It was not. So he did not use the police department as he should have to try and stem what became a completely out of control urban breakdown.
So in conclusion, this is why it is so important to vote. Now, I will say it's not easy because you have to do research. You don't want to just vote for anyone just because of the party or just because of what they're saying during their campaign speeches. Many times politicians will say whatever they need to say to get them in office, so you want to do additional research. When the country was created, it was never meant for citizens to just sit back and let politicians do all the work. Part of this country is us getting involved. And if we all get involved, things will improve.